Welcome back to our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. So, we've been exploring all these fascinating and sometimes frustrating ways our minds work, but Kahneman doesn't just leave us hanging with all these biases. He actually offers some strategies for making better decisions.
Okay, good, because I was starting to get a little worried there.
Right, yeah. One approach is to create what he calls risk policies. Think of them as predetermined guidelines for navigating those tricky situations.
Okay, so it's like having a set of rules to follow when your emotions might be clouding your judgment.
Exactly. So, for example, imagine you're trying to decide whether to invest in a hot new stock.
Okay.
And your system one might be screaming, buy, buy, this is going to make you rich.
Yeah.
But a predetermined risk policy could be never invest more than 5% of your portfolio in a single stock, no matter how tempting it seems.
So you're essentially taking the emotion out of the equation
Exactly.
and relying on a more rational, predetermined rule.
Right.
I like that. These risk policies can be applied to all sorts of decisions, from financial investments to relationship choices to even deciding what to eat for dinner.
Absolutely. Kahneman also talks about the importance of broad framing, which is essentially taking a wider perspective when making decisions.
Okay, so instead of getting hung up on one particular outcome,
Right.
we should consider the bigger picture.
Precisely. He gives the example of a gambler who might feel devastated after losing a single bet. But if they zoom out and consider their overall wins and losses over time, that individual loss might seem less significant.
Yeah, it's like don't sweat the small stuff.
Right.
Sometimes we need to focus on the long game, not just the immediate outcome.
Exactly. And this broader perspective can be applied to so many areas of life.
Yeah.
If you're working towards a long-term goal, there will inevitably be setbacks along the way.
Yeah.
But if you maintain that broad frame, those setbacks won't derail your progress.
Okay, so deep divers listening at home, think about your own lives for a second. Are there any areas where you could benefit from adopting a broader frame? Like it could be anything from your career goals to your personal relationships, even how you manage your daily to-do list.
Absolutely. And, another thing that I found so interesting about Kahneman's work is how it really challenged this traditional economic model of rational decision making.
So you're telling me that economists have been operating under a false assumption all this time.
Well, maybe not false, but certainly incomplete.
Okay.
The traditional model assumes that people are rational actors who consistently make choices that maximize their utility.
Hmm.
But Kahneman's research reveals that our decisions are often driven by emotions, biases, and heuristics, as we've already seen.
So we're not as rational as we like to think we are. Color me surprised.
It's not that we're completely irrational, but rather that our rationality is bounded by our cognitive limitations and our emotional responses.
This makes me think about all those times I've made a financial decision that seemed completely sensible at the time, but in hindsight, clearly driven by fear or greed.
Oh, yeah, and that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Kahneman's prospect theory, for which he won the Nobel Prize, it offers a more realistic model of how people actually make decisions under conditions of uncertainty.
Okay, let's unpack prospect theory.
All right.
What are the key takeaways?
Well, we already touched on one of the core principles, which is loss aversion.
Yeah.
But another crucial insight is that people's risk preferences, they actually change depending on whether they're facing a potential gain or a potential loss.
So we might be more cautious when it comes to potential gains,
Right.
but more willing to gamble when we're trying to avoid a loss.
Exactly. This explains why people sometimes hold on to losing investments for far too long, hoping to avoid the pain of selling at a loss, even if it makes more sense financially to cut their losses.
Prospect theory is so insightful. It explains all those seemingly irrational financial behaviors that we see all around us, right?
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of understanding those psychological factors at play in our decision making.
Yeah.
We're not just calculating machines, our choices are shaped by our emotions, our biases, and our unique perspectives.
I'm curious, have you ever made a financial decision that seemed irrational at the time? But now, after learning about prospect theory, you can kind of understand why you made that choice.
All the time. It's amazing how much more sense our seemingly irrational behaviors make when you factor in loss aversion and the way our risk preferences shift.
Speaking of seemingly irrational behavior, I want to circle back to the concept of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self that we talked about earlier.
Great. The experiencing self is living in the moment, feeling all the sensations and emotions of an experience as it happens.
Hmm.
The remembering self is the one that forms memories of those experiences and shapes our overall impressions.
And what's fascinating is that these two selves, they don't always agree. Kahneman uses the example of colonoscopies, which is maybe not the most pleasant topic, but it illustrates the point perfectly.
Sure.
So patients who underwent a longer colonoscopy, but with the pain gradually decreasing towards the end, actually reported the experience as less unpleasant overall
Right.
than those who had a shorter procedure with consistent pain.
Exactly. It's almost like our brains are wired to prioritize the peak and the end of an experience,
Wow.
even if those moments don't accurately reflect the overall quality of the experience.
It makes you wonder, are we making choices based on how we think we'll remember them rather than how we're actually experiencing them in the moment?
It's a profound question, and it really has implications for all sorts of choices we make in life. Think about vacations, for example.
Yeah.
Are we choosing destinations and activities that will provide us with, Instagram-worthy memories, even if it means sacrificing relaxation and genuine enjoyment in the present moment?
Right. Are we creating memories for our remembering selves, or are we actually living our lives for our experiencing selves?
It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah.
And this also leads us to the implications of Kahneman's work for public policy.
So how can understanding our cognitive biases actually help us create a better society?
Well, Kahneman argues that policymakers should be aware of the ways our intuitions and biases can lead to irrational choices,
Mhm.
especially in areas like healthcare, finance, and environmental protection.
So we need policies that help people make better choices, even if those choices aren't always aligned with their gut feelings.
Precisely. He's a proponent of what's called libertarian paternalism.
That sounds like an oxymoron. How can something be both libertarian and paternalistic?
Right, it seems like a contradiction.
Yeah.
But it's really about designing policies that preserve freedom of choice while also gently nudging people towards choices that are likely to be in their best interest.
So it's like offering healthy food options in a cafeteria without banning junk food altogether.
Exactly. Or
We're making retirement savings plans opt out instead of opt in.
exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all human, and that means we're all susceptible to biases and cognitive shortcuts.
Yeah.
But instead of trying to force people to be rational, we can create environments that make it easier for them to make choices that align with their long-term goals.
That's a much more humane and realistic approach
It is.
than simply assuming that everyone will act in their own best interests all the time.
Right. And it brings us back to the central theme of thinking fast and slow,
Uh-huh.
understanding the limitations of our own minds,
Yeah.
and developing strategies to overcome those limitations.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much more to explore in thinking fast and slow. We'll be back soon for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve into the concept of expertise, the planning fallacy, and the ultimate takeaway from Kahneman's groundbreaking work.